Standing at the altar, in her grandmother's pearl-white gown, Seraphina watched the ancient cathedral doors swing shut behind the man who had sworn eternal love to her. The vampire king had just abandoned their wedding ceremony, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps and a room full of supernatural nobility, who now stared at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. But what they didn't know was that this humiliation would become the catalyst for the greatest revenge story in vampire history, because in exactly 60 minutes, she would be walking down that same aisle again, this time toward his most dangerous enemy, a man who had been waiting centuries for the perfect moment to destroy the king who had once betrayed him. Sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold. Sometimes it's served with wedding vows and a crown that was never meant to be yours. Seraphina Blackthorn had always believed that being chosen by the vampire king was the greatest honor a mortal woman could receive. For 3 years she had prepared for this moment, learning the ancient customs of vampire royalty, studying their political structures, and most importantly, falling desperately in love with Damien Ashworth, the man who ruled the entire supernatural underworld with an iron fist wrapped in velvet charm. The Cathedral of Eternal Shadows had never looked more magnificent than it did on what was supposed to be her wedding day. Thousands of blood-red roses cascaded from the Gothic arches, their petals scattered across marble floors that had witnessed centuries of vampire ceremonies. The guest list read like a who's who of supernatural society, ancient vampire lords, powerful witches, influential werewolf pack leaders, and even some fey nobility who rarely left their mystical realms to attend mortal affairs. Seraphina's reflection in the ornate mirror showed a woman transformed. Her auburn hair was swept into an elaborate updo, secured with diamond pins that had belonged to vampire queens for generations. The wedding gown, a masterpiece of ivory silk and intricate beadwork, hugged her curves before flowing into a train that seemed to stretch forever behind her. Her green eyes, usually bright with confidence, now held a nervous excitement that made her appear almost ethereal. Her maid of honor, Isabella, a vampire who had become her closest friend during the engagement, fussed over the final details. "You look absolutely radiant, Sarah. Damien won't be able to take his eyes off you." Isabella's voice carried the musical quality that all vampires possessed, but today it seemed strained with an emotion Seraphina couldn't quite identify.
The morning had started perfectly.
Seraphina had awakened in the guest chambers of the royal vampire estate, surrounded by gifts from well-wishers and feeling like she was living in a fairy tale. The breakfast of fresh fruits and delicate pastries had been prepared by the castle's finest chefs, and even the weather seemed to be cooperating, with soft grey clouds providing the perfect atmosphere that vampires preferred for their most important ceremonies. But as the hours passed, small things began to feel wrong. Damien hadn't come to see her, which wasn't unusual according to vampire tradition, but there had been no personal message, no token of his affection sent through a trusted messenger. The castle staff, usually warm and welcoming, seemed distracted and kept whispering in corners before falling silent whenever she approached. By noon, when it was time to begin the processional, Seraphina's stomach was knotted with anxiety she couldn't explain. The massive doors of the cathedral stood open, revealing an interior lit by thousands of candles and filled with the most powerful supernatural beings in existence. At the far end, past rows of ornate pews, stood the altar where she would pledge her eternal love to the man who had swept her off her feet with his dark charm and promise of adventure. As she began her walk down the aisle, the train of her dress whispering against the stone floor, Seraphina's eyes searched for Damien. He stood at the altar in his ceremonial black attire, looking every inch the powerful vampire king he was. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his pale skin seemed to glow in the candlelight, and his red eyes held an intensity that had always made her pulse race. But something was different about his posture, something rigid and distant that made her steps falter slightly. The wedding march, played on an ancient organ that had been blessed by vampire priests centuries ago, filled the cathedral with haunting melody. Each step brought her closer to the man she loved, but also closer to a growing sense that something fundamental had changed. The guests watched her progress with expressions that seemed more curious than celebratory, and she could feel the weight of their stares like a physical presence. When she finally reached the altar, Damien's eyes met hers for just a moment. In that brief glance, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Not love, not desire, not even affection, but a kind of resigned duty, mixed with something that looked almost like regret. He took her hands in his, and she was startled by how formal the gesture felt, lacking the warmth and passion she had always associated with his touch. The vampire priest, an ancient being whose age was measured in millennia rather than centuries, began the ceremony with words in the old language that few modern vampires even understood. The ritual was beautiful and solemn, filled with traditions that connected them to countless generations of vampire royalty. Serafina tried to lose herself in the moment, to focus on the words of commitment and love, but Damien's distracted demeanor made it increasingly difficult. Then came the moment that would change everything. Just as the priest was asking for the exchange of vows, a younger vampire approached the altar with obvious urgency. He whispered something in Damien's ear that made the Vampire King's expression harden into something Serafina had never seen before. Without warning, Damien released her hands and stepped back, his red eyes now cold and distant. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence of the cathedral. "I cannot do this." The words hit Serafina like a physical blow. She stood frozen at the altar, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Around them, the assembled guests began to murmur, their voices creating a low buzz of shocked conversation. The vampire priest looked as stunned as she felt, his ancient face showing an expression of disbelief. "Damien, what are you talking about?" Serafina's voice came out smaller than she intended, barely audible in the vast space of the cathedral. But he was already turning away, his ceremonial cape flowing behind him as he strode toward a side door that led to the castle's private chambers. "The Werewolf Council has declared war," he said without looking back. "I have more pressing matters to attend to than a wedding ceremony." The casualness of his dismissal was like a knife to her heart. 3 years of courtship, months of planning, a lifetime of dreams, all dismissed as less important than politics and power. Serafina watched him disappear through the door, leaving her standing alone at the altar in her grandmother's wedding dress, surrounded by hundreds of supernatural beings who were now staring at her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella rushed to her side, her vampire grace allowing her to reach the altar in seconds. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea he was going to." But her words trailed off as she realized there was nothing she could say that would make this moment less devastating. Serafina felt tears threatening, but she refused to cry in front of the assembled supernatural nobility. Instead, she lifted her chin with a dignity she didn't know she possessed and surveyed the crowd. Their faces showed everything from sympathy to barely concealed amusement. Some of the older vampires looked genuinely angry at Damien's breach of protocol, while others seemed to be calculating how this scandal might affect their own political positions. That's when she saw him. In the back of the cathedral, leaning against a pillar with his arms crossed, was a man who seemed completely unaffected by the drama unfolding at the altar. Tall and imposing, with silver hair that caught the candlelight and eyes the color of storm clouds, he watched the proceedings with what appeared to be mild interest rather than shock. When their eyes met across the length of the cathedral, he smiled, not with mockery, but with something that looked almost like admiration. Serafina didn't know who he was, but something about his presence gave her the strength she needed to make her next move. Instead of fleeing in tears or collapsing in humiliation, she turned to face the assembled guests and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the cathedral. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears that the Vampire King has decided that politics are more important than honor," she announced, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "But that doesn't mean this day has to be a complete waste." The murmur that ran through the crowd was electric with anticipation. Everyone could sense that something significant was about to happen, but no one could predict what the abandoned bride might do next. Serafina could feel the weight of history in this moment, could sense that her next words would echo through supernatural society for decades to come. As she stood there in her wedding dress, surrounded by the most powerful beings in the supernatural world, Serafina Blackthorn made a decision that would change not just her own life, but the entire balance of power in the Vampire Kingdom. The abandoned bride was about to become something far more dangerous than anyone in that cathedral could have imagined. The stranger with storm-grey eyes moved through the crowd like a predator, his presence causing other guests to unconsciously step aside. As he approached the altar, Serafina could feel the shift in the cathedral's atmosphere. Conversations died mid-sentence, and even the most powerful vampire lords watched his progress with wary respect. She realized this wasn't just any wedding guest. This was someone whose mere presence commanded attention, and perhaps a little fear. "Lady Serafina." His voice was deep and smooth, with an accent she couldn't quite place but that spoke of old money and older power. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Adrian Nightfall, and I believe we have something in common." The name sent a ripple of recognition through the assembled guests. Adrian Nightfall was a legend whispered about in vampire circles, though few had actually seen him in person. He was older than most of the ancient vampires present, rumored to be one of the first of his kind, and more importantly, he was Damien's oldest enemy. Their conflict went back centuries, rooted in a betrayal that had cost Adrian everything he once held dear. And what might that be, Mr. Dear? Nightfall? Serafina asked, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even herself. She was acutely aware that every word of this conversation would be repeated in supernatural circles for years to come. We've both been betrayed by the same man, Adrian replied, his eyes never leaving her face, though I suspect your betrayal is far more public than mine ever was. He gestured elegantly to the abandoned altar, the scattered rose petals, and the gaping doorway through which Damien had disappeared. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Isabella tried to intervene, stepping protectively towards Serafina, but Adrian's cold gaze stopped her in her tracks. This is between the lady and myself, he said quietly, but with an authority that made it clear any interference would be unwelcome. What are you proposing? Serafina asked, though she suspected she already knew. The idea forming in her mind was so audacious, so perfectly vindictive, that it took her breath away. I'm proposing we give your former fiancé exactly what he deserves, Adrian said, his smile sharp as a blade. You want revenge for being humiliated in front of supernatural society's elite. I want revenge for crimes committed against me long before you were born. Perhaps we can help each other achieve our goals. The vampire priest, who had been standing frozen in shock throughout this exchange, finally found his voice. This is highly irregular, he protested weakly. The ceremony has been dissolved. The preparations were for a different union entirely. The preparations were for a wedding, Adrian corrected smoothly. The identity of the groom seems to be the only thing that has changed. He turned his attention back to Serafina, extending his hand in a gesture that was both invitation and challenge. What do you say, Lady Serafina? Shall we give them something to really talk about? The audacity of it was breathtaking. To marry Damien's greatest enemy, in Damien's own cathedral, using Damien's own wedding preparations, in front of witnesses who would spread the story across the supernatural world within hours. It was the kind of revenge that would become legend, but it was also incredibly dangerous. Adrian Nightfall wasn't known for his mercy or his gentle treatment of those who crossed him. Tell me why I should trust you, Serafina said, studying his face for any sign of deception. For all I know, this could be some elaborate scheme to humiliate me further. Adrian's expression grew serious, and, for a moment, the mask of urbane charm slipped away to reveal something raw and honest underneath. Because, Lady Serafina, I recognize a kindred spirit when I see one. You're not broken by what just happened. You're angry. And anger, properly channeled, is the most powerful force in any world, mortal or supernatural. He was right, Serafina realized. Beneath the shock in her, beneath the embarrassment of being abandoned at the altar, was a burning rage that demanded satisfaction. Damien had treated her like a disposable convenience, something to be discarded the moment politics became more pressing than personal commitments. He had humiliated her in front of the most influential beings in the supernatural world, and he had done it with such casual indifference that it was clear he had never truly valued her at all. What would you gain from such an arrangement? She asked, still not entirely convinced this wasn't some elaborate trap. The satisfaction of taking something Damien thought was his, Adrian replied honestly, and perhaps the pleasure of having an ally who understands the true nature of betrayal. His eyes hardened as he continued. Damien destroyed my family, my clan, and my territory 3 centuries ago. He left me with nothing but my life and a burning need for justice. Today, he handed me the perfect opportunity to begin taking back everything he stole from me. The cathedral had fallen so quiet that the sound of Serafina's heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud in her own ears. She was aware of hundreds of eyes watching her, waiting to see what the abandoned bride would do. Some faces showed curiosity, others concern, and a few displayed the kind of excited anticipation that came from witnessing potential chaos unfold. Isabella finally found her voice. Sarah, you can't be seriously considering this. You don't know anything about him. He could be dangerous. More dangerous than staying here and being pitied by everyone who witnessed my humiliation? Serafina asked, her voice sharp with determination. More dangerous than spending the rest of my life as the woman who wasn't worth keeping? She looked around the cathedral, taking in the ornate decorations that had been prepared for her dream wedding. The guests who would forever remember this day as the time the vampire king abandoned his bride for politics. The flowers, the music, the carefully planned ceremony, all of it suddenly felt like a monument to her own naivete. "Very well," she said, turning back to Adrian with decision crystallizing in her voice. "I accept your proposal." The gasps that echoed through the cathedral were audible now, mixed with excited whispers and the sound of several guests pulling out their communication devices to spread the news immediately. Adrian's smile was triumphant as he took her hand, and she was surprised by how warm his skin felt, how steady his grip was. "Priest," Adrian addressed the stunned religious figure, "I believe you have a ceremony to perform."
But this is the paperwork alone,"
the priest stammered, looking around desperately, as if hoping someone would intervene to stop this madness. "The paperwork can be adjusted," Adrian said smoothly, producing a document from his jacket with the kind of efficiency that suggested he had come prepared for exactly this possibility. "I took the liberty of having the necessary forms prepared, just in case an opportunity like this might arise." Serafina stared at the papers he handed to the priest. The marriage contract was legitimate, bearing the seals of supernatural authorities, and written in the ancient language that made such unions binding in both mortal and immortal law. The realization hit her that this hadn't been a spontaneous decision on Adrian's part. He had planned this, had come to her wedding prepared to steal the bride if the opportunity presented itself.
"You knew," she said, understanding dawning in her voice. "You knew Damien was going to abandon me."
"I suspected he might," Adrian admitted without shame.
"Damien has always been predictable in his selfishness. When word reached me about the werewolf situation this morning, I calculated there was a significant chance he would prioritize politics over personal commitments. I came prepared for multiple possibilities. The calculated nature of it should have bothered her, but instead, Serafina found it oddly comforting. At least Adrian was honest about his motivations, unlike Damien, who had spent 3 years pretending to love her while apparently seeing her as nothing more than a political convenience. "And if he hadn't abandoned me?" she asked.
"Then I would have attended your wedding as a polite guest and looked for other opportunities to achieve my goals," Adrian replied.
"But I admit this outcome is far more satisfying than anything I had originally planned."
The priest was examining the marriage documents with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was looking for any legal reason to refuse to perform the ceremony. But vampire marriage law was ancient and precise, and Adrian had clearly done his homework. The documents were flawless, meeting every requirement for a legitimate supernatural union. "These appear to be in order," the priest finally admitted reluctantly, "but I must warn you both that vampire marriage bonds are not easily broken. The ceremony creates connections that go far beyond mortal legal contracts." "I'm quite aware of the implications," Adrian said calmly. "Lady Serafina?" She looked at him, this dangerous stranger who was offering her the chance to transform her greatest humiliation into the most spectacular revenge in supernatural history. There was still time to back out, to flee the cathedral and try to rebuild her life somewhere far from vampire society. But that would mean Damien won, that his casual dismissal of her worth would stand as the final word on their relationship. "I understand the consequences," she said firmly. "Proceed with the ceremony." The priest sighed deeply, clearly wishing he was anywhere else in the world, but began to speak the ancient words that would bind them together. As the ceremony progressed, Serafina became aware of subtle changes in the cathedral's atmosphere. The excited whispers grew louder. Several guests were openly making calls to spread the news, and she could see flashes of light as photographs were taken to document this unprecedented moment. When Adrian slipped a simple platinum band onto her finger, she was struck by how different this felt from the elaborate ceremony she had planned with Damien. There was no romantic love here, no dreamy anticipation of a fairy tale future. Instead, there was something sharper and more honest. 2 people united by mutual benefit and a shared desire for justice against someone who had wronged them both. "You may kiss the bride," the priest announced with obvious reluctance. Adrian's lips touched hers briefly, formally, but she felt a jolt of something unexpected. Not love, but recognition. They were both survivors, both people who had been underestimated and betrayed. Whatever else this marriage might become, it was built on a foundation of mutual understanding that her relationship with Damien had never possessed. As they turned to face the assembled guests as husband and wife, Serafina caught sight of movement in the doorway that Damien had used for his dramatic exit. Several of his royal guards stood there, their faces shocked as they realized what had just transpired. One of them immediately turned and ran, presumably to inform his king that his abandoned bride had just married his greatest enemy. The real adventure was just beginning. Within an hour of the impromptu wedding ceremony, the news had spread throughout the supernatural community like wildfire. Serafina found herself in Adrian's private chambers, a luxurious suite in a wing of the estate she had never been permitted to enter during her engagement to Damien. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now seeing parts of the vampire royal property that had been forbidden to her as the king's intended bride. Adrian's quarters reflected a man of sophisticated tastes and considerable wealth. Ancient tapestries depicting scenes of supernatural history covered the walls, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum filled the spacious rooms. But what struck Serafina most was the evidence of Adrian's intelligence. Shelves lined with books in dozens of languages, maps of territories spanning continents, and correspondence that suggested he maintained connections throughout the supernatural world. "Regrets?" Adrian asked as he poured himself a glass of what appeared to be very expensive wine, though Serafina suspected it wasn't entirely wine. "About marrying a man I've known for less than 2 hours despite my former fiancé?" she said, accepting the glass he offered her. "Surprisingly, no. Ask me again in a week when the reality sets in." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking on the chamber door. Adrian's expression didn't change, but Serafina noticed how his posture shifted, becoming more alert and ready for confrontation. "Come," he called. Isabella burst through the door, her usually perfect vampire composure completely shattered. "Sarah, what have you done?" she demanded, her voice pitched higher than Serafina had ever heard it. "Do you have any idea what kind of danger you've just put yourself in?" "Enlighten me," Serafina replied calmly, though her heart was beating faster than she would have liked. "Adrian Nightfall isn't just Damien's enemy," Isabella said, shooting a nervous glance at the man in question. "He's been declared a rogue by the Vampire Council. He operates outside supernatural law. His territory was stripped from him decades ago for violations that included refusing to bow to corruption," Adrian interrupted smoothly. "But please, continue with the official version of events. I'm always curious to hear how history is being rewritten." Isabella's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't try to charm your way out of this. Everyone knows you've been building an army of supernatural outcasts. The Council considers you a threat to the established order." "The established order?" Adrian repeated with amusement. "You mean the system that allows someone like Damien to abandon his bride at the altar for political convenience?" "Yes, I can see why they would consider me a threat to that." Serafina looked between them, realizing there were layers to this situation that she hadn't fully understood. "What exactly are these violations you've been accused of?" she asked Adrian directly. "I refuse to hand over members of my clan to be executed for the crime of loving outside their species," Adrian explained, his casual tone not hiding the steel underneath. "I provided sanctuary to supernatural refugees fleeing persecution, and I declined to participate in the Council's more questionable political maneuvers."
He paused, swirling his wine.
"Oh, and I may have killed a few officials who tried to force the issue."
Isabella made a sound of frustration.
"You see? He's dangerous, Sarah. And now you're legally bound to him by vampire law. Do you understand what that means?" Before Serafina could respond, another knock echoed through the chambers. This time it was more insistent, carrying the authority of someone who wasn't asking for permission to enter. Adrian set down his wineglass and moved toward the door, with fluid grace. But his hand rested on the ornate hilt of a sword that hung at his side. "Lord Nightfall," a cold voice called from the hallway. "By order of King Damien, you are commanded to present yourself and your bride for immediate audience." Adrian's smile was sharp as a blade as he opened the door. 3 of Damien's elite guards stood in the hallway, their formal armor polished to mirror brightness. Behind them stood Marcus, Damien's chief advisor, a vampire so old that his pale skin seemed almost translucent. "Marcus," Adrian greeted the advisor with mock warmth. "How lovely to see you again. I trust you're well." "Cut the pleasantries, Nightfall," Marcus replied icily. "The king demands an explanation for this unprecedented breach of protocol." "Which protocol would that be?" Adrian asked innocently. "The one about not stealing another man's bride? Or the one about not abandoning her at the altar in the first place?" Serafina stepped forward, deciding it was time to speak for herself. "I think you'll find that King Damien forfeited any rights to object to my actions when he walked out of our wedding ceremony. I'm quite sure vampire law is clear on that point." Marcus's ancient eyes fixed on her with an expression of barely controlled anger. "Lady Serafina, you have involved yourself in matters far beyond your understanding. Lord Nightfall has been manipulating you for his own purposes. This marriage is a mockery designed to cause political chaos, as opposed to my previous engagement, which was apparently designed to be discarded the moment something more important came along."
Seraphina's voice carried a bitter edge that surprised everyone in the room, including herself.
The werewolf situation required immediate attention, Marcus explained stiffly.
His Majesty had no choice but to postpone personal matters in favor of preventing a war. Postpone? Adrian laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. Is that what we're calling it? How interesting. I suppose that means he plans to reschedule the wedding once his political crisis is resolved. The silence that greeted this question was telling. Marcus's expression made it clear that no such rescheduling had been discussed, and Isabella's pained look confirmed what Seraphina was beginning to understand. Damien's abandonment hadn't been a temporary delay caused by urgent circumstances. It had been a permanent decision disguised as a postponement. I see, Seraphina said quietly, the pieces falling into place. There was never going to be another wedding, was there? The werewolf situation was just a convenient excuse to end an engagement that was no longer politically useful. Lady Seraphina, Marcus began, but she cut him off. No, I think I understand perfectly now. 3 years of courtship, months of wedding planning, a relationship that I thought was built on love. All of it was just political theater, and when the script changed, I became expendable. She turned to Adrian. At least you were honest about your motivations from the beginning. Marcus stepped forward, his ancient authority radiating from him like heat. Regardless of the circumstances, this marriage is a legal complication that cannot be allowed to stand. Lord Nightfall is considered an enemy of the crown. His union with King Damien's intended bride could be interpreted as an act of war. Could be interpreted, Adrian repeated thoughtfully, or could be celebrated as a demonstration that even abandoned brides deserve better than being treated as disposable political assets. His tone grew darker. But if Damien wants to consider it an act of war, I'm perfectly prepared to oblige him. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Seraphina realized she was witnessing a confrontation that had been building for centuries.
This wasn't really about her or even about the wedding.
This was about old grievances, ancient betrayals, and power struggles that predated her existence. There's another option, Isabella said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. The marriage could be annulled. Vampire law allows for annulment in cases of coercion or fraud. Lady Seraphina could claim she was emotionally compromised and not capable of making rational decisions. No, Seraphina said firmly, surprising everyone including herself. I will not be painted as a victim who was too distraught to know her own mind. I made this choice deliberately, with full awareness of the consequences. Even if those consequences include being caught in the middle of a supernatural war? Marcus asked. Especially then, Seraphina replied. I'm tired of being treated like a delicate flower who needs to be protected from unpleasant realities. If my marriage to Adrian causes political complications for King Damien, perhaps he should have considered that before he decided I was expendable. Adrian's expression showed genuine approval for the first time since she had known him. You see, Marcus, the lady is quite capable of speaking for herself, and she's made her position clear. This is madness, Isabella whispered. Sarah, you don't understand what you're getting into. The vampire world is not kind to those who challenge the established hierarchy. Then perhaps it's time for the established hierarchy to change, Seraphina said, feeling a strange sense of freedom in finally speaking her mind. If the current system allows people like Damien to treat others as disposable conveniences, then maybe it needs to be challenged. Marcus's face had gone pale with anger, a remarkable achievement for someone who was already corpse-white. You speak of things that could bring chaos to our entire civilization. Your civilization brought chaos to itself the moment it decided that political convenience was more important than honor, Adrian said calmly. Lady Seraphina and I are simply choosing not to pretend otherwise. One of the guards stepped forward, his hand moving to his weapon. Lord Nightfall, you will accompany us to the king immediately, or we will be forced to use alternative methods of persuasion. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Adrian's demeanor shifted from urbane charm to something far more dangerous. I think you'll find that your alternative methods are significantly less effective than you imagine, he said softly. Seraphina found herself caught between terror and exhilaration as she realized she was about to witness exactly what kind of power her new husband wielded. The guards were elite warriors, trained from childhood to protect the vampire royal family, but something in Adrian's posture suggested he viewed them as minor inconveniences rather than serious threats.
Wait, she said, stepping between the opposing forces, before violence could erupt.
There's no need for bloodshed. We'll come willingly to see King Damien. After all, I think it's time we had a proper conversation about the situation. Adrian raised an eyebrow at her intervention, but nodded slowly. As my wife wishes, he said. the emphasis on the word wife making it clear that the title carried real meaning for him. As they prepared to leave for what was certain to be a confrontational audience with the Vampire King, Seraphina realized that her impulsive decision to marry Adrian Nightfall had set events in motion that would reshape the supernatural world. She was no longer the abandoned bride seeking revenge. She was a player in a game of power and politics that stretched back centuries. The question was whether she was strong enough to survive what came next. The throne room of the Vampire King had been designed to intimidate. Massive columns of black marble stretched toward a vaulted ceiling lost in shadows, while torches in iron sconces provided just enough light to create an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. The throne itself was carved from a single piece of obsidian and positioned on a raised dais that forced visitors to literally look up to their ruler. Everything about the space was calculated to remind anyone who entered that they stood in the presence of absolute power. Damien sat on his throne with perfect posture, his ceremonial crown catching the flickering light. He had changed from his wedding attire into more formal royal garments, deep purple robes with silver threading that emphasized his pale skin and dark hair. But Seraphina could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the armrests of his throne, and she realized that despite his composed facade, he was furious. Standing to his right was the Vampire Council, 5 ancient beings who served as advisors and judges in matters of supernatural law. Their faces were impassive, but Seraphina could sense their disapproval radiating from them like cold fog. These were beings who valued tradition and stability above all else, and her marriage to Adrian represented chaos incarnate. Seraphina, Damien's voice echoed in the vast chamber, formal and cold. You have created quite a situation. She walked forward with Adrian at her side, very aware that their entrance was being observed and judged by some of the most powerful beings in existence. But instead of feeling intimidated, she discovered that her anger was growing stronger with each step. This was the man who had claimed to love her, who had promised her eternity, who had abandoned her without even the courtesy of a private explanation. I have created a situation, she replied, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustics of the throne room. How interesting. I was under the impression that you created this situation when you walked out of our wedding ceremony.
A murmur ran through the assembled courtiers, who lined the walls of the throne room.
It was unusual for anyone to speak to the Vampire King with such directness, especially someone who was technically still human. But Seraphina was discovering that having nothing left to lose was remarkably liberating. The werewolf crisis required immediate attention, Damien said stiffly, repeating the explanation that was already wearing thin. I had hoped you would understand the necessity of postponing our ceremony. Postponing, Adrian said, speaking for the first time since entering the throne room. Such an interesting choice of words. Tell me, Damien, exactly when were you planning to reschedule? Next month? Next year? Next century? Silence. One of the council members snapped. You have no right to speak in this chamber, rogue. Adrian's smile was sharp as winter wind. I have every right to speak on behalf of my wife, Councillor Aldrich. Or have the laws changed so dramatically since my exile that husbands are no longer permitted to defend their wives' interests? The word wife seemed to hit Damien like a physical blow. His composure cracked for just a moment, revealing something raw and possessive underneath. Your so-called marriage is a mockery, he snarled. A ceremony performed in desperation by a woman who was clearly not in her right mind. Careful, Seraphina said, her voice dangerously quiet. You're coming very close to suggesting that I'm too weak-minded to make my own decisions. I think we both know that's not true. She stepped forward, moving closer to the throne despite the obvious tension in the room. The guards along the walls shifted nervously, clearly uncertain about whether they should intervene. Let me make something very clear, Your Majesty. I married Adrian Nightfall with full knowledge of who he is and what that marriage represents. I did so because I refuse to be treated as a disposable convenience. You don't understand the implications of what you've done, Damien said, rising from his throne. The movement was fluid and threatening, reminding everyone present that despite his political responsibilities, he was still a predator at his core. Nightfall is an enemy of this kingdom. Your alliance with him puts you in direct opposition to everything I've built. Everything you've built, Seraphina repeated slowly. You mean the system that allows you to make promises to people and then discard them the moment something more pressing comes along? Yes, I can see why you would consider that worth protecting. The throne room had gone completely silent except for the crackling of torches. Even the ancient council members were watching the exchange with fascination, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the long history of vampire politics. "You want to know what I understand?" Serafina continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I understand that you never loved me. I was a political asset, useful for cementing alliances with human supernatural hunters and showing the mortal world that vampires could be civilized. But the moment that usefulness ended, so did your interest." "That's not true," Damien said, but his protest lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Serafina challenged. "Then explain to me why, in 3 years of courtship, you never once mentioned the possibility that political crises might interfere with our wedding. Explain why you never thought to include me in discussions about the werewolf situation, despite the fact that my family has connections to several influential packs. Explain why your first instinct when faced with a difficult decision was to abandon me rather than find a way to handle both responsibilities." Damien's eyes blazed red with anger, and several courtiers took involuntary steps backward.
You dare question my decisions in my own throne room? I dare question the decisions of a man who claimed to love me and then proved that claim was worthless, Serafina replied without backing down. And I notice you haven't actually answered any of my questions. Adrian watched the exchange with obvious approval, but Serafina could sense his readiness to intervene if Damien's anger turned violent.
The tension in the room was becoming almost unbearable, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "Enough," Councillor Aldrich declared, stepping forward to restore order. "This personal drama, while fascinating, is not the primary issue we must address. Lord Nightfall, your marriage to this woman is a deliberate provocation. What are your terms?" "Terms?" Adrian's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "I'm afraid I don't understand. I married a beautiful woman who was cruelly abandoned by her previous fiancé. What terms would you expect me to have?" "Don't play games," another council member snapped. "You've been building power in the shadows for decades. This marriage gives you a direct connection to the royal family and a claim to legitimacy you've never possessed. What do you want in exchange for annulling it quietly?" "Ah, now I understand the confusion," Adrian said smoothly. "You assume this is some elaborate political maneuver on my part. How flattering that you credit me with such foresight." His expression grew more serious. "But the truth is far simpler. I saw a woman being treated with unconscionable disrespect by a man who should have valued her above all political considerations. I offered her an alternative, and she accepted. You expect us to believe this is about chivalry?" Damien's voice dripped with scorn. "I expect you to believe what you choose to believe," Adrian replied calmly. "But ask yourself this. If this was some grand scheme to destabilize your kingdom, wouldn't I have chosen a less public venue? Wouldn't I have tried to win Lady Serafina's affection gradually, rather than proposing marriage to a woman I had never met?" Serafina felt a chill, as she realized Adrian was right. If this had been a calculated political move, it would have been handled very differently.
The spontaneous nature of their marriage actually supported his claim that it was motivated by opportunity rather than long-term planning. However, Adrian continued, his tone shifting to something more dangerous.
Now that the marriage has taken place, I find myself in the interesting position of being related to the royal family by law.
And as Lady Serafina's husband, I have certain obligations to ensure her honor is properly defended. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. In vampire society, a husband's duty to defend his wife's honor could justify almost any action, including violence against those who had dishonored her. By abandoning Serafina at the altar, Damien had provided Adrian with legal justification for retaliation under supernatural law. "You wouldn't dare," Damien said, but uncertainty flickered in his red eyes. "Wouldn't I?" Adrian's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Try me." The standoff stretched taut between them. Centuries of hatred and fresh insults creating a volatile combination that threatened to explode into violence. Serafina could feel the weight of history in this moment, could sense that whatever happened next would reshape the vampire world. But before either man could make a move, she stepped directly between them. Her human fragility suddenly the most dangerous thing in the room. If they fought now, she would almost certainly be killed in the crossfire. "Stop," she said quietly, but with such authority that both ancient vampires actually obeyed. "This isn't about your old grievances or your political maneuvering. This is about the fact that I refuse to be treated as property to be traded, abandoned, or fought over." She turned to face Damien directly, looking up at the man she had once thought she loved. You made your choice when you walked away from our altar. You chose politics over promises, duty over devotion, and expediency over honor. That choice has consequences, and one of those consequences is that you no longer have any claim on my loyalty or my future." Then she turned to Adrian, meeting his storm-grey eyes with steady determination. "And you need to understand that while I appreciate your intervention, I am not a prize to be won or a weapon to be wielded against your enemies. I am a person making my own choices for my own reasons." The throne room was so quiet that the crackling of torches sounded like artillery fire. Serafina could feel the weight of dozens of stares, could sense that every word of this confrontation would be repeated and analyzed for decades to come. "My marriage to Adrian Nightfall stands," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "Not because I was manipulated or coerced, but because I choose to align myself with someone who at least has the honesty to admit his motivations, rather than hiding behind false promises and convenient excuses." The finality in her voice seemed to break whatever spell had held the room, frozen. Damien sank back onto his throne, his face a mask of carefully controlled fury and what might have been genuine hurt. The council members began whispering among themselves in the old language, clearly debating how to handle this unprecedented situation. But Serafina wasn't finished. "And if anyone in this room thinks they can intimidate me into changing my mind through threats or political pressure, I suggest you reconsider. I've already lost everything I thought mattered to me today. That makes me considerably more dangerous than you might assume." As she spoke these words, Serafina realized they were true. She had nothing left to lose, no reputation to protect, no future plans that could be threatened. It was a terrifying freedom, but it was also a kind of power that none of the ancient beings around her could fully understand. The abandoned bride had become something entirely new. 6 months after the wedding that shocked the supernatural world, Serafina stood on the balcony of Adrian's mountain estate, watching the sun set over territories that now belonged to them both. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered in ancient forests, valleys shrouded in mist, and in the distance the lights of several small towns where supernatural beings lived freely without fear of persecution. The estate itself had been a revelation. Far from the dark, foreboding castle she had expected, Adrian's home was a sprawling manor built of worn stone and filled with surprising touches of comfort and beauty. Gardens bloomed in carefully tended terraces, libraries held collections that scholars would kill for, and the staff moved with the easy efficiency of people who were valued rather than merely employed. "Admiring your domain?" Adrian's voice came from behind her, warm with an affection that had grown genuine over the months of their unconventional marriage.
"Our domain," Serafina corrected, turning to smile at the man who had become far more than a convenient means of revenge.
I still can't quite believe how much has changed. The changes had been dramatic indeed. Within weeks of their marriage, other supernatural beings had begun arriving at Adrian's estate, seeking refuge from the increasingly rigid control of the Vampire Council. Werewolves fleeing persecution for interspecies relationships, witches whose magic was considered too progressive, vampires who had fallen out of favor with the political establishment. They all found sanctuary in the territories that Adrian controlled. What had started as a marriage of spite and convenience had evolved into something that resembled a revolution, not a violent overthrow, but a quiet gathering of those who wanted something different from supernatural society. Adrian's reputation as a rogue had attracted exactly the kind of people who were willing to challenge the status quo, and Serafina had discovered she had a talent for organizing their efforts into something coherent and purposeful. "Any word from the council?" she asked, accepting the glass of wine Adrian offered her. "The usual threats and demands," he replied with a shrug. "They want us to dissolve our territorial claims and submit to royal authority. Damien, in particular, seems to think that if he applies enough pressure, you'll come to your senses and return to him." Serafina laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement rather than bitterness. "He still doesn't understand that this was never about him, does he? It was about me refusing to be treated as expendable." The truth was that her feelings about Damien had evolved from hurt and anger to something approaching pity. Reports from their spies in the royal court suggested that the Vampire King was struggling with the political ramifications of losing her. The werewolf crisis had been resolved, but not without significant concessions that made him look weak. Other vampire lords were beginning to question his judgment, and the fact that his abandoned bride had married his greatest enemy had become a symbol of his failure to command loyalty. "Speaking of Damien," Adrian said carefully, "Isabella sent a message. She wants to arrange a private meeting with you. Apparently she has information about something called the Convergence." Serafina's expression grew serious. The convergence was a rumored gathering of supernatural leaders that was supposed to happen only once every few centuries, when major changes to their world's political structure were being considered. If it was really being called, it meant the council was planning something significant. What kind of information? She asked. She wouldn't say in the message, only that it concerns you directly, and that the situation is more dangerous than we realize. Adrian's grey eyes met hers with concern. I don't trust her motives, but the information might be valuable enough to risk a meeting. Before Serafina could respond, Marcus, one of Adrian's trusted lieutenants, appeared on the balcony with the kind of urgency that meant important news. My lord, my lady, we have visitors at the main gate. A delegation from the Eastern vampire clans flying flags of truce. Adrian and Serafina exchanged glances. The Eastern clans had remained neutral in the growing political tensions between Adrian's territories and the royal court. Their sudden appearance could mean either an opportunity for alliance or a trap designed to lure them into negotiations they couldn't win. How many? Adrian asked, his tactical mind immediately assessing the potential threat. 12 vampires, including clan leader Anastasia herself, Marcus replied. No obvious weapons, but they're requesting immediate audience with both of you. Anastasia was old enough to remember the founding of the current vampire political system, and influential enough that her opinions carried weight throughout supernatural society. If she had come in person, rather than sending an envoy, the matter was serious indeed. Have them escorted to the formal receiving room, Serafina decided, surprising both men with her quick assumption of authority. And make sure our own people are positioned strategically throughout the manor, just in case this truce flag is less genuine than it appears. As they prepared to receive their unexpected guests, Serafina reflected on how much her role had evolved since that disastrous wedding day. She was no longer the naive human woman who had thought marriage to the vampire king would guarantee her safety and happiness. Instead, she had become something new, a bridge between the human and supernatural worlds, a leader who commanded respect through competence rather than birthright, and a woman who had learned that real power came from refusing to be diminished by others' expectations. The formal receiving room of Adrian's estate struck a careful balance between displaying wealth and avoiding intimidation. Rich tapestries and elegant furniture spoke of prosperity, but the space was designed for conversation rather than the kind of psychological dominance that characterized vampire royal courts. When Anastasia entered with her delegation, Serafina could see the older vampire taking note of these details with approval. Anastasia herself was a striking figure, tall and elegant, with silver hair that seemed to glow in the lamplight and violet eyes that held centuries of wisdom. She moved with the fluid grace that all ancient vampires possessed, but there was something more approachable about her manner than Serafina had expected. Lady Serafina, Lord Adrian, Anastasia began with a formal bow that managed to be respectful without being subservient. I come bearing greetings from the Eastern clans and a proposition that may interest you both. We're honored by your visit, Serafina replied, falling naturally into the diplomatic role she had learned to play. Please be seated. Can we offer you refreshment? The rituals of vampire hospitality were observed with careful precision, creating a civilized veneer over what everyone in the room knew could be a life-or-death negotiation. When the formalities were complete, Anastasia leaned forward with an expression that was both serious and calculating. I assume you're both aware that the Vampire Council is planning to call a convergence, she began without preamble. What you may not know is that they intend to use the gathering to formally strip Lord Adrian of all territorial rights and declare your marriage null and void. Adrian's expression didn't change, but Serafina could see the tension in his posture. On what grounds? He asked calmly. Treason against the crown, corruption of royal bloodlines, and incitement to rebellion, Anastasia replied. The charges are politically motivated, of course, but they'll be presented with enough legal justification to convince the neutral clans to support them. And what is your clan's position on these charges? Serafina asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Anastasia's smile was sharp as a blade. The Eastern clans believe that the current royal court has become too rigid, too focused on maintaining power rather than serving the broader supernatural community. Your territories have become a haven for those seeking alternatives to the established order, and frankly, many of us find that development encouraging rather than threatening. The implication was clear. The Eastern clans were prepared to support Adrian and Serafina against the council, but they wanted something in return. In vampire politics, nothing was ever offered without expecting payment. What do you propose? Adrian asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. An alliance, Anastasia said simply. The Eastern clans formally recognize your territorial claims and provide military support if the council attempts to enforce their decree by force. In return, you agree to establish a formal alternative to the current political system. Not a rebellion aimed at destroying the monarchy, but a parallel structure that provides genuine choices for those who want them. Seraphina felt her pulse quicken as she realized what was being offered. This wasn't just protection from Damien's political maneuvering. This was the opportunity to create real change in supernatural society, to build something better than the rigid hierarchy that had treated her as disposable. "You're talking about splitting the vampire world in half," she said, making sure she understood the full implications. "I'm talking about acknowledging that it's already split," Anastasia corrected. "Your marriage and the way you've run your territories have created a focal point for every supernatural being who wants something different. The question is whether that division happens through negotiation and mutual agreement, or through conflict that could destabilize our entire civilization." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal from every angle. Finally, he looked at Seraphina with an expression that asked for her opinion without words. The decision would affect her as much as him, and he was making it clear that he valued her judgment. "There would be conditions," Seraphina said, addressing Anastasia directly. "Any alliance would need to include protections for the humans and other non-vampire supernatural beings who have found sanctuary in our territories.
And we would need guarantees that this alternative system would be genuinely democratic, rather than just replacing one form of autocracy with another."
Agreed, Anastasia said immediately, which told Seraphina that the vampire leader had expected such conditions and was prepared to meet them.
As the negotiations continued into the night, Seraphina found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a human woman planning to marry a vampire king and live a life of elegant servitude. Now, she was helping to shape the future of supernatural society, creating alternatives that could provide genuine freedom for beings who had never experienced it. The abandoned bride had become something no one could have predicted, not a victim seeking revenge, but a leader building something new. And as she looked at Adrian, seeing the pride and affection in his storm grey eyes, she realized that their marriage of convenience had become the foundation for a love story that was far more epic than anything she could have imagined. When the delegation finally departed with preliminary agreements in hand, Seraphina and Adrian stood together on the balcony where their conversation had begun. The night was clear, stars visible in the darkness above their mountain retreat, and the future stretched before them full of possibility and danger in equal measure. "Any regrets now?" Adrian asked, echoing his question from their wedding day. "Only that it took me so long to understand what I was really capable of," Seraphina replied, leaning into his embrace. "Damien thought he was discarding something worthless when he walked away from that altar. I think we've proven him wrong." Adrian's laughter was warm against her hair. "My dear wife, I think we're just getting started." In the distance, lights flickered in the towns under their protection. Homes where supernatural families lived without fear for the first time in generations. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but filled with hope for something better than what had come before. The abandoned bride had found her true kingdom at last.